So he is presented by the media as a big advocate for peace. That is embedded in American culture is duplicity of trying to present to the public as though they really have a choice in these elections. The fact is, Hillary Clinton, who's the front runner among the Democrats, when she first went to Afghanistan and Iraq, she said, we're making a big mistake. We have put more troops in there. We have to get total control. That is, now she's presented, see, what has happened is the American public has joined the rest of the world. There is not a country in the world, except possibly Israel, that has supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq, where the people support it. In the United States now, the overwhelming majority have grave doubts about this war or out and out oppose it. So they've all had to shift how they present themselves for fear that an opposition would arise in the United States. This is the great power of the two-party system. The the Republicans are in charge of promoting the interests of the corporate rulers and to push it as far as they can. The Democrats are to control the people so that no opposition ever appears. And that's a very different task, and therefore they appear as very different parties. But they serve the same money interests, and they actually work together as a team to create utter confusion in America. And so far, the American people, there's been a long tradition of rebellion. First, the abolitionists, the people who fought against slavery, built the party. Then there was this massive rise of the populist movement. And there were socialists at the turn of the century that tried to build unions. And so there has always been an effort in America by the people to gain political power and to have influence. And in America today, we are very far from having an alternative voice. But I see a crisis coming. I think the credibility of these two parties is declining. The Congress of the United States, only 10% of the American people will say they support the Congress. And for the president has about, 23, 24% support. So the overwhelming majority do not support them. The largest grouping in America are people who say, I'm an independent, not a member of either party. In California, where I am, 21% of the people are not registered Democrat and Republican and have not one representative in the state government. That is, they have this two-party monopoly that has crushed freedom, limited democracy, and limited the rights of the American people. Most people throughout the world don't understand. The United States is very different from Europe. They don't have a death penalty in Europe. They have universal health care. And there have many parties, and if 20% of the people vote for a party, they get 20% representation. America is totally different. America is way behind Europe. Not that Europe's perfect. I don't want to say this is good and this one's the bad one. There are actually a lot of similarities also. But the United States, in a way, is the most backward nation in the world in terms of the fact that it has more prisoners than any other nation.
Before you go to that, okay. Peter, in terms of what you did, I think you made many important points, and I want to follow up on that. In terms of what you said about the Democratic Party, I think the clearest example supporting your position is the fact that in 2006, most people voted for the Democrats thinking they're going to end the war. And that whole thing has been now totally forgotten. It has been sort of, put under the rug, and there is no discussion of that. People are confused as to what was supposed to happen, what does not happen, what was supposed to be Nancy Pelosi's role, is she playing it or not playing it. So I think that capacity to take the vote, pretend to be in opposition, and then mislead the whole effort is very clearly what you have said.
Well, in the election in 2004, they ran a candidate for president, Democrats, named John Kerry. John Kerry ran on a pro-war position. Basically, he said, I can do the war better than Bush. He was for everything Bush was doing, but he would do it better. He said we should have more troops there. The Democratic Party members opposed the war, but were told that the important thing was not whether you're for or against the war, but to get Bush out. There's another illusion which is very popular in America. They think that Bush runs the United States. The corporate world controls the United States. The money that's behind, the media could destroy George Bush in 10 days if it chose to. The power of George Bush is completely limited. It would be impossible for him to do what he did without the Democratic Party supporting him. If the Democratic Party, as the majority party, had opposed him, stood up to him, called for demonstrations in the streets against him, he would have been crushed immediately. In fact, in 2000, George Bush lost the election. Now, most people in Europe and the Arab world and everything don't understand democracy where the candidate who loses gets elected. But in America, we have a system that allows that. And so George Bush lost the election, and then all the Democrats had to do was to demand a recount or a re-election in the state of Florida, where the Republicans had denied tens of thousands of people the right to vote who were the most likely voters for the Democrats. And they stood up and absolutely opposed doing anything about it, having a recall, and their candidate was the president of the Senate. He voted against doing anything about it. They handed it to George Bush, even though he had lost the election.
Now, in the context that we are talking about sort of this Democratic Party playing the role that it is playing in the Republican Party in the election, the whole thing, isn't it the fact that most people are beginning to defect from that position? They are not having that kind of an impact because of the global media. And I want you to comment in the context of this global media on two factors, and I'll come the rest. The one factor is, as the think tank of the CIA itself, National Intelligence Institute, has predicted that in 20 years, first the Chinese economy, and then in 40 years, the Indian economy will surpass the US economy and the European economy. Yeah. So within 30 years, which may be long for you and me as individuals, but they are now no long for, in terms of human communities, we will move from a single superpower world to a multipolar world, number one. Yes. Number two, we also know within 50 years, the demography of this country will change. There will be no single group, there will be more than 50%. Given people of color having a different role inside this country, and three nations of Asia, namely Japan, China and India, and even Russia would call itself Eurasia, partly Asian, partly Russian, partly European. How do you see the dynamics of the internal change and external change putting some limits on the imperial outreach?
Well, I think what you have described is absolutely unquestionable. The statistics are clear. The United States is now in decline in the world. And the world, there's going to be a shift of power in the world regardless. And the United States is therefore very frustrated. The first one is the end of oil. The cheap supply of energy, which is the American economy and the whole world economy was built on, is coming to an end. There just is no more oil. We're using it all up, and it's going to end within the next 20 to 30 years. But you don't get right to the end before you have the crisis. You have the crisis as you begin to approach it. So the United States is in a crisis. The invasion of Iraq is clearly an effort by the United States to dominate oil over Europe. That is, this war is really against the Europeans. And the Europeans they're watching it, and they're sort of loving it to watch the United States get entangled and get defeated. The United States, by the way, is losing the war in Iraq because here's what people have to understand. You go in to do an imperial type thing, the way Britain used to do, and after 5 years, they can't get it done. And they have the most powerful army with all the technology, and they're fighting people who all they have is a machine gun in their hands, and they have no helmet, they have no body, they have no tanks, they have no airplanes. And 5 years later, the people are still resisting and refuse to allow themselves to be occupied by the United States. The American media, just by using the words that this is everybody who opposes America is called a terrorist, do not understand. The American people are completely ignorant, understanding that the people of Iraq have to be against, in every poll, their own secret polls have shown the overmajority of the people in Iraq oppose the U.S. occupation. So the mythology that we're there to bring democracy, while we support dictatorships all the way around. It's every country near Iraq, with the exception of Iran, we support dictatorships. So the United States government, the whole war is a complete and total myth from beginning to end. The United States is in decline. There are other sectors of the world that are rising, and it's going to change the whole configuration. But this is, and you see it in Venezuela, in my country.
I want to come to Venezuela in one second. Okay. But Peter, it seems to me something has happened in Iraq that needs to be noted, and that is, and I'm not the only one, Charlie Rose, I think, was the first one, and he has repeatedly asked his guest, has Iraq defined the outer limit of America's military power? And almost invariably his guest had said, yes, Iraq has defined the limits to America's military power. But there are diplomatic consequences to that. For instance, I would like you to comment on this. Would you say that because US military power was checkmated in Iraq, that has given a different kind of signal to Russia and China, whose conduct at United Nations Security Council is very different than it was 4 or 5 years ago, and just Russian president Putin going to Iran and sending a different message is partly a consequence of the checkmate in Iraq. Will you say that's the case?
Well, first, we have to go back to Vietnam. The Vietnamese suffered 2 million casualties, but defeated the United States militarily without an air force, without tanks, and without money.